Hey everyone, thank you all for joining me here in bed. What we're talking about today is one of the largest mass kidnappings in US history. We're covering the case of Chowchilla. And if you've never heard of the Chowchilla kidnapping, you're not alone. I hadn't either. So I'm going to give you a quick summary just so we're all on the same page. A school bus with 26 children aboard, as well as the driver, was hijacked, kidnapped, and then buried alive. All the shocking twists and turns of this case are going to have you hanging on to your pillows for dear life. This is so crazy. So this case has 3 perpetrators, but we'll mainly focus on the ringleader, Frederick Woods, who from now on we're just going to call Fred because that's what he went by and it's easier. Fred was born October 15th, 1951, just outside of San Francisco. Fred was born into wealth, like rich, generational old money wealth. And he grew up in a very upscale community in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He had very few to no friends, and his parents were always away traveling. They traveled the world, but always left Fred behind, and he was raised by the staff and nannies. His father hired him at a rock quarry that he owned. This rock quarry was called California Rock and Gravel Company. Remember this fact because it's going to be significant to the case later. It was shortly after Fred started working there that he started hanging out with 2 new people, James and Richard Schoenfeld. We're going to refer to them from here on as Jim and Rich, though. Jim and Rich are brothers. I do know that they were 2 years apart and that Jim and Fred are the same age. Jim and Rich grew up very wealthy. Not rich like Fred, but very wealthy nonetheless. They did have a similar childhood in that they all grew up very privileged, spoiled, and had everything handed to them. All 3 men did attend the same school actually, but none of them were friends. Jim and Fred even graduated in the same year. I did find speculation that Fred had called Jim to ask if he'd be interested in helping build some old cars or fix up some of these old cars that he had bought. And Jim agreed, but as long as he could bring his brother Rich. While fixing cars, the 3 of them spent a lot of the time chatting, but mostly complaining, and mostly about their parents. What they complained the most about is that their parents didn't give them enough money. So, for reasons unknown, I don't really know why, but all 3 of them were financially cut off from their parents. Instead of going to work like a normal person, like you or I, if we suddenly had no more income, they decided to find an easier way to make money, and they decided that easy way would be stealing cars. But it didn't take long before these dummies were all caught, arrested, and charged. Of course, their rich parents just came and bailed them out, and the 3 of them figured since there really wasn't any punishment, this was all free game. So, with all of their free time, they just started watching movies about bank robberies and ransom cases, and they decided that they could come up with a huge plan to do something for really big money. However, they clearly aren't great criminals since they've already been caught stealing cars. They wanted to try and find one job that would make a lot of money. Over the course of a year, they plotted and planned, and they came up with a sinister idea, which was, as I said, kidnapping a busload of children and demanding a ransom of $5 million. I have a really hard time not going, $5 million. Now that you have the background story, let's get into what actually happened. On July 15th, 1976, it was a sweltering hot day in the town of Chowchilla. It was the second last day of summer school for the Dairyland elementary kids. Chowchilla is a really small farming community just 100 miles south of San Francisco. And it's the kind of town where everyone knows each other. It was the 1970s, and you generally knew your neighbors well, and probably everyone on your street. But in Chowchilla, you knew everyone in town, and people felt safe there. Nothing bad ever happened. The kids took the bus to and from school every day, and that bus ran like clockwork, always arriving on time. On the 15th, they left for school, and in the morning for summer school, they went and did actual schoolwork, and then every afternoon they would have an outing or a field trip. And on this particular day, they were all going swimming. The bus driver's name was Ed Ray. Ed was in his 50s and had driven the bus for decades. In fact, he was the bus driver to most of these children's parents. So obviously, everyone loved Ed. The kids were having a fantastic day. They had a lot of fun swimming, and as they were riding the bus home, they were all chatting excitedly and singing songs. However, that cheerful, happy day was about to take a dramatic turn that changes their lives forever. Currently on the bus, there were 26 children left to be dropped off. So on this narrow road, as they're driving along, and suddenly right in front of Ed, there was a white van blocking the road. Ed's first thought was that obviously this poor person has broken down and probably needs help. When you live in Chowchilla, you help everyone, and you don't give it a second thought. It would never have crossed Ed's mind that there was a sinister plan behind this. So Ed slowed and stopped the bus right in front of the van, but just as he did, 3 men jumped out of the van with like pantyhose covering their faces like a mask, and they all had shotguns pointed right at Ed. They all started screaming and shouting to him that if he even considered backing up, they would shoot him. They demanded that Ed open the bus door, which put him in a really terrible situation. I can't even imagine you got your hand on that door handle, and there is no good choice. He obviously doesn't want to open the door and let these men in with the 26 kids, but if he doesn't open the door and they shoot him, they're getting in anyways, and they don't have an adult with them. So Ed reluctantly complies and opens the door. Fred, Rich, and Jim load the bus, and the poor children aboard were terrified. The kids on this bus were as young as 5 years old and no older than 14. The men started pointing their guns and threatening all of the kids, which obviously is just going to make them scream louder and become more scared. And as they're screaming, Fred yells over top of them for them all to shut up. And then he orders Ed to get out of the driver's seat and walk and sit down at the back of the bus. Ed gets up and tries to silently comfort all the kids as he walks by, just by smiling or touching or squeezing a shoulder. Jim gets in the driver's seat. Fred stands facing the children with his gun pointed at them, and Rich gets off the bus and goes back into the van. The bus fires up and starts down the road, and Rich follows behind in the white van. Obviously, when you're driving a bright yellow school bus, it's very easy to spot. So the first part of the plan was to ditch the bus. They drove for about 30 minutes to a dry riverbed that was completely covered in bamboo. The bamboo had grown taller than the bus, and it easily concealed it. So, as this was pre-planned, the men already had a second van parked there strategically. They pulled the van one by one and backed it up to the door of the bus so that no one would actually step onto the ground, leaving footprints or evidence. They had each child walk the aisle one by one down and get from the bus and step right into the van. I cannot imagine how scared these kids would have been. I would have been terrified, and I'm at 5. Like, awful. They have no idea what's going on, and now they are being marched into a van. A van, both, had been modified for this kidnapping. The windows were painted over, every crack, every crevice, every hole filled in, and they had wood panels on the sides, the floor, and the roof, making sure that not a speck of light was getting into this. They created a black hole prison, essentially. As Ed was getting in to this van, he realized that this was definitely a pre-planned kidnapping. He obviously had to stay calm and not say anything to the children because he was the only trusted adult that all 26 of them had to depend on in this situation. Once all 27 people were loaded up, the 3 men jumped in and drove away with both vans filled with their prisoners. The van doors were closed, and it was so dark in there that you literally could not see your hand in front of your face, never mind who was beside you or where they were being taken. They could tell that the first roads they were on were definitely country gravel roads because it was bouncing them all around. And then finally onto smooth pavement where they stayed, and they drove for hours and hours. Like I said, it was mid-July in California. The temperatures would have been crazy high, and there was no air, no food, and no water. There was also no washroom. Kids started vomiting, some obviously from being afraid and some probably from being car sick and bounced around. After driving for so long, people started to need to use the washroom. So Ed devised a plan where the kids would all go to the washroom in the middle of the van. That way the perimeter of the van where they were all seated wouldn't have mess in it. The older kids tried really hard to help distract the younger kids. They were singing songs and chatting. They even sang the song, "If You're Happy and You Know It," but instead of saying happy, they sang sad. They drove for 12 hours in the blistering heat. 12 hours in a van with no air, no food, not even water. The van did stop once halfway through for gas, but the kids were not let out and the doors were not opened. By now, back in Chowchilla, parents are realizing that their kids are missing. Like I said, the bus is never late, so they started calling the school thinking maybe the bus had broken down, and a search party was sent out just on the bus route looking for it, but nothing was found. Again, it's the 1970s, so there weren't cell phones. They couldn't call Ed and be like, "Hey, where are you?" or track his phone by Find My Phone. But by 7:30, 3 hours after the kids were scheduled to be home, everyone was worried. A police helicopter was sent up and did spot the bus, which would have been the only way you would have seen this bus because it was covered in that bamboo. As a parent, hearing that the bus is found but your kids are not there would be any parent's worst nightmare. The police still had hope, and they did have a strong suspicion that the kids were alive because next to the bus there were 2 different tracks from 2 different vehicles. So they came to the conclusion that this was likely a ransom kidnapping. The FBI got involved and immediately sent 30 agents to Chowchilla. I grew up in a small farming community. 30 FBI agents in that type of town would be crazy, and it would have just seemed unreal. The news broke, not just nationwide, but worldwide, that 26 children and a bus driver had been kidnapped. The kidnappers are now making their way 100 miles to that rock quarry we talked about, the same one that Fred's father owns. Obviously, it does not take 12 hours to drive 100 miles, but they needed to arrive at the rock quarry in the middle of the night, so they basically drove aimlessly for 12 hours. At 4 a.m., when they were sure that there would be no one at the quarry, they drove the vans over to a huge hole in the ground. This hole had a ladder sticking out of it. Fred swung the van door open, grabbed Ed and dragged him first out of the van, slamming the door quickly behind him. Fred wanted Ed out first. Being that he was the only adult, he was really the only threat, and they wanted that under control. Ed had been stuck in the van with, again, no air, no water, and would likely have been pretty out of it. Fred demanded that Ed climb that ladder into the manhole-sized space that leads underground. Ed silently complies. He hopes that this is going to keep the children safe. When Ed gets to the bottom of the ladder, suddenly an entire room opens up, which would be so weird. You're in this small manhole climbing down this ladder in dirt, and as you get to the bottom, this mysterious room opens up. But once Ed actually had a chance to have his eyes adjust and look around, what he thought was a room was actually a semi-truck trailer. The 3 men now are with these vans and open a van door, taking one child out at a time and then quickly slamming it shut behind, leaving all the kids alone in the darkness, wondering what's happening. As each child comes out, the 3 men ask for their full name, their phone number and their full address, and then have them remove an article of clothing. The men wanted this information. Obviously, they needed it in order to be asking for ransom, and they wanted the clothing item as proof that they did have that child. Once they had the information, they would force the child down the ladder and into the buried trailer below. The kids waiting in the van were clinging to the sides of the van so as not to be pulled out. They were terrified that they were all being taken out one by one and killed. They had no idea what was going on. But eventually they all made it to that underground prison and started looking around. In the far corner, there was a very small light. It really didn't make much difference in the shadows of that trailer. They could see there were a few mattresses on the floor and some makeshift toilets that they had made out of wooden boxes and cut a hole into them. And then there was a small table with food and water, but there was only enough food for maybe 4 people, definitely not 27. The men shouted down the hole, like, "We'll be back for you," and pulled the ladder up, sealed the hole with a metal plate, and then placed 2 large truck batteries on top of it, each weighing 100 pounds. Suddenly, from below, they could hear dirt being shoveled and hitting the metal plate. And this is when they all realized they were being buried alive. So, we're going to break this down. Using the rock quarry that was owned by Fred's dad, they were able to find land further back in there that wasn't being used by anyone at the quarry. Then they hired diggers, and they had a huge hole dug in the ground, and they had a ramp formed down into it. And that's how they drove the truck underground. The truck, by the way, was purchased with Fred's dad's money. Hey, I'm just going to spend my dad's money on kidnapping 27 people. I don't think he'll mind. Anyway, once underground, they modified the truck enough to house their hostages, making the wood box toilet, tossing mattresses onto the ground, and they did install a very poorly built, weak ventilation system. But to be honest, I'm actually shocked that they even thought of ventilation. Once it was completely underground, they buried the entire rig, leaving only a small manhole for everyone to get underground with a ladder. From above, though, there was no evidence that this even existed. You could literally be standing on top of the truck and have no idea it was even there. Their plan was well underway. The 3 men head over to Fred's house. Now is the big moment. This is the moment that they get to phone in their ransom demands. And they were so excited. They were so close to $5 million. So they called the Chowchilla Police Department to give their demands. They dial the number and they're waiting, but it keeps ringing back busy. As I said, this didn't just make local news, this made world news. So all the lines were flooded with calls. And again, it's the 70s, so I don't imagine I have a ton in Chowchilla, people answering phones or even lines. Friends, family, media, concerned citizens, they're all trying to call the Chowchilla Police Department. So after trying and trying, the 3 men weren't able to get through to make their demands. So giving up on this plan of calling right now, they decided they'd come up with something later. However, they'd worked so hard. They decided they really did deserve a nap. I mean, think about it. 27 hostages, 2 vans, 12 hours of driving. A nap would be the obvious choice here. So all 3 of them lay down for their well-deserved nap and get comfy. But this siesta would actually be the downfall of what they planned for an entire year for. By this time, they'd been buried for a few hours, and things were just getting worse. There is obviously no way out. Ed has spent hours scouring the trailer for any possible escape. He's kicking the walls and feeling around, trying to find any gap or space that he could pry open. It was getting super stuffy and difficult to breathe in there. I did say there was a ventilation system, but I also said it wasn't well constructed. It was basically just a hose that led upward through the ground, and on the other side was a very, very tiny fan that was blowing the fresh air through the hose. By this time, they were already running out of food and water, and the kids were frantic. And on top of that, the toilets are already full and beginning to overflow. Can you imagine? July in California, no ventilation, no air, buried alive in a metal trailer with overflowing toilets, nothing to eat, drink, and no hope of escape. I think I'd be in hysterics too. Ed was trying very hard to keep the kids still and calm. He knew the more they cried and the more they panicked and ran around, the more oxygen they were using. 12 hours go by and they are still underground, but by now that tiny ventilation system has stopped working. Guess why? The fan ran out of batteries. Who uses battery-powered fan for ventilation? So now there was absolutely no fresh air at all coming in, but that wasn't even the biggest issue, if you can believe it. The roof of the trailer has started to cave in. Clearly, this was not well thought out. Never mind the terrible ventilation that was run on batteries, but this was an old trailer, like very old, and had a huge load of dirt just dropped on top of it. So the roof is caving in and now the sides are beginning to bow. Ed and probably some of the older kids have started to realize with no way out, they were either going to suffocate, starve, or be crushed. They were literally about to die. All while Fred, Jim, and Richard are still napping. One of the 26 was a 14-year-old boy named Mike Marshall. He was the oldest child that had been on the bus and was trying his best to help Ed keep everyone calm, to ration food. He also obviously understood that this was a do or die situation and decided that he was getting everyone out. He was driven and he truly believed he could get everyone out. Mike told Ed that they'd have to get out the same way they got in, through the manhole in the ceiling. Ed was very skeptical. He didn't think they'd be able to. And even if they did, he was terrified that the three men were just standing up there waiting for them to climb through only to shoot them. Mike agreed this was a likely possibility, but he said, either way, we're dying. If we stayed here, it's guaranteed death. Escaping is the only choice that seems logical. He said even with the risk that Ed's fears were true, it was a better gamble and at least some likelihood that they were going to live. What they did was they started grabbing those mattresses and stacking them one on top of the other. They were able to get it to the point where both Ed and Mike were able to reach the roof and feel that metal plate, and they began pushing on it, but it was so heavy they couldn't move it. Just the plate was heavy enough, but let alone there's 200 pounds of batteries on top of that. Mike was determined and he wasn't going to give up. They continued to just push and push and push until finally they were able to move the plate a tiny bit, and it gave them enough to just keep inching and inching until they were able to get enough of a hole for Mike to stick his arm through and try and feel and figure out what was on top of that plate. He didn't know what he was feeling. He did know that there were two objects up on top of there. So they started to rock the plate back and forth as best as they could until they were able to move the batteries off the plate. Now, to hear me explain this sounds like it went by very quickly, but this took hours and hours. They continued until Mike was able to fit through the hole. All of the kids were screaming and cheering and celebrating, but the celebrations ended very quickly because once Mike got through that plated hole, he didn't find himself on the outside. He found himself in a wooden box that was buried underground. Unbeknownst to the people that were below, the trio left, placing a wooden box over top of the manhole and then buried the whole thing in dirt. And no matter how hard Mike tried pushing on that box, it wouldn't budge. We're just on such a high thinking you are freeing 26 children and all your hard works pay off and you're just about to be there, only to find you're no closer than you were before. At this point, Ed all but gave up. He was deflated, both emotionally and physically. But Mike refused. He stayed up there. He was not giving up, and he just continued to pound, kick, and push that box over and over again. Till all of a sudden, the box gave way just a little. And this was all the fuel Mike needed to carry on, and he continued to wail on that wooden box until he could see the dirt above the box and started to dig. He dug and dug until soil just started flooding the box, and it was followed by a ray of sunlight bursting through. Mike then was rushed by the freshest, cleanest air he had ever breathed in his life. However, he's still cautiously aware that, as Ed said, there could potentially be 3 men standing there waiting for him to crawl through just to kill him. But despite how scared he was, Mike pulled himself out of the hole and stepped into the outside world, ready to face whatever might be there. And as he looked around, he realized there was no one there. No one and nothing. Once he's sure that they're alone there, he shouts down the manhole to Ed, letting him know the coast is clear. Mike could hear the roar of excitement and joy from the children below, and Ed begins helping the children through one by one into fresh air. By 8 p.m. on the 16th of July, more than 24 hours after being kidnapped, all 27 finally escaped. This story to me, no matter how many times I read through it and researched little pieces of it, it just does not seem real. Like, it doesn't even seem like it could be real. If any of you are like movie writers or novelists, this is a fantastic true story idea. This is just crazy. Getting back to the story. Now, even though they are all above ground, this isn't over yet. They're still standing in a rock quarry in the middle of nowhere. They don't know where they are. They just know they need to get to safety. But as they stand there looking around, they suddenly become aware of the sound of big machinery, like heavy machinery running in the background. Obviously, this would be scary. They don't know who's running that machinery. It really could be those 3 kidnappers. And they're also vulnerable, standing there out in the open where they could easily be spotted. They didn't feel they had any other option but to just start heading towards the sound of the possible danger. And suddenly, in the distance, they spot some construction workers. And Ed starts screaming and yelling, "We're from Chowchilla! We're from Chowchilla! We need help!" Well, like I said, the kidnapping had been broadcast worldwide, so these men had seen it for sure. So these men clearly knew that these were the 26 missing children and called the police immediately. Finally, the kids and Ed are all rescued, and they're taken for medical care to check and make sure that they are all physically okay. But around midnight, a Greyhound bus arrives to take the children back to Chowchilla. A lot of the kids were very apprehensive about getting on the bus, but can you really blame them? They're very young kids, and the last time they were on a bus, they were kidnapped and buried alive. So I feel like their apprehension is pretty normal. So everyone reluctantly agreed to get on the bus and head back to Chowchilla. Once they pulled into the police station there at around 4 a.m., all the parents were waiting for them in the parking lot. And every time, like, I'm already choking up because every time I read this, I think about that moment. You, as a parent, you didn't know if your kids were even alive. And now you find that they were kidnapped and they're coming home safe. And you watching them coming down those stairs from that Greyhound bus, like that overwhelming feeling. Or as a little 5 or 6 year old, seeing your parents, like, having them scoop you up in their arms, not knowing if you were ever having that again. Whew, sorry. I feel like it would be a very emotional moment. And I think that there would have been a lot of tears and hugs and just so many different feelings, relief and whew. And although a happy ending is so nice, we can't forget about our 3 sleeping beauties. So while all this is going on, these 3 idiots, if you can believe it, are still napping. Still. So when they finally all wake up, like, oh, that was a good nap, they flip on the TV and they realize that all 27 hostages have not only escaped, but have been rescued and are safe. I would have loved to have seen their dumb faces when they realized that even with an entire year to plan, they were bested and outsmarted by 26 children. The humorous part is they didn't even get to make their ransom demands. They slept through it all. Like, that is probably the best part for them. They missed out on that thrill and that power of being able to demand that the police and the state comply with what they were asking. I don't know. You gotta find joy in the little things in life, right? Especially when you do a lot of reading of cases like these. It doesn't happen very often that you find little happy tidbits. Once they realized it was all over, Fred and Jim both packed up and took off. Rich decided to stay behind. And just lay low. The police were determined to find out who did this, and they were obviously not letting anybody get away with it. The children and Ed weren't really able to give a good description. Like I said, the kidnappers are wearing the pantyhose nylons over their head. And so the police started back at the beginning and went to the underground trailer looking for clues. They started speaking with people at the quarry and asked the security if they had seen anything. Security told them that 3 men a few months prior had been digging a very, very large hole. And one of these men just happened to be the son of the owner, Fred Woods. So the police started looking into Fred and see that he has some convictions for grand theft auto, which then directly leads them to Jim and Rich, who were also convicted of the same crimes, and the 3 of them were very rarely seen apart. Once they find this out and they search Fred's house, they find all the evidence they needed. Not just clues, but these idiots wrote out the plans for the kidnapping. The police literally found a piece of paper that said plan at the top of it in quotations, and then had bullet points of the entire kidnapping plan underneath it on this piece of paper. Could you be more stupid? Who does that? Anyway, not only that, but they found a draft of the ransom letter demanding the $5 million. So clearly this was a closed case. I'm not sure how you think you're getting away with something so big when your first planning moment is to sit down with a pen and paper and write plan on the top. How are kidnapping 27 people? And you think you're smart enough to get away with this? The other thing is, honestly, if you're going to run, take the paper with you at the very least, or better yet, destroy it before you go. Why take off without the papers? That was my little rant. Later that day, Rich decided to turn himself in. Obviously, he knew this was over for him. And then his brother Jim was found shortly after that, trying to make his way across the United States. It took 2 weeks for police to find Fred, and he was in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. He made it all the way to Canada. Fred was finally caught, though, and he was brought back to California to face justice. The case went to trial, and all 3 men did plead guilty to 27 counts of kidnapping for ransom. And when they were asked why they did this, Jim said, even though they all came from wealthy families, he and Fred were deep in debt. And when asked why a busload of children, he replied, we needed multiple victims to get multiple millions, and we picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay ransom for them, and they don't fight back. The case and the trial were not straightforward because for whatever reason, they were willing to plead guilty to 27 counts of kidnapping, but they refused to even bend on 8 counts of bodily harm. This dragged the case out and they had to go to trial. But just 16 months after these kids were abducted, some of them were brave enough to come and talk about the ordeal and what effects it's had on them, what it did to cause them bodily harm. And they did all say that they were caused bodily harm. They had cuts and bruises, they were dehydrated, they had a lack of oxygen. All of those things would cause bodily harm on top of the emotional trauma that they went through. So Obviously, after hearing this, plus evidence, the jury found all 3 men guilty and they were sentenced to life without parole. I just want to stop for a minute and just say to you, it really, to me, stands out that 14-year-old Mike was the hero in the story. Ed helped too, and he was great about taking care of everybody, but Mike was 14, and he's the reason that all 27 of them got out and got out alive. Sadly though, this is not where it ends, because they did, all 3 men, appeal the convictions of bodily harm, and they was turned over. So the 3 men had to be resentenced, and they were given life, but with the possibility of parole. And then in 2012, after 36 years in prison, Rich Schoenfeld was released. Shortly after, in 2015, his brother Jim was released at the age of 63. But Fred, he didn't get out as soon, because as it turned out, he'd been running an illegal car business from prison using his trust fund. This boggles my brain. How are you able to run an illegal car business? And why do you have access to a trust fund while you're in prison? Like, is there no rules or supervision? I don't get that. He was also caught with contraband of it, like things like cell phones, pornography, and this was repeatedly. He applied and was denied parole 19 times. But finally, in August 2022, at the age of 70, he was granted release. Although, how hard would that be? Because he comes from old money. As soon as he did get out of prison, he was living his best life, filthy rich. Tragically, as adults, a lot of the victims still report that they are living with lifelong, lasting trauma and effects from this. Our star hero, 14-year-old Mike, did have a rough go in life for a very long time, but has finally turned his life around, and he seems to be doing very well and is very happy. Ed was given an award for outstanding community service and has since gone on to be the local hero for keeping all the children safe and alive. Although almost all the identities of the children have been kept anonymous, which is understandable. I don't know much about where they are or how they're doing, but I do hope that all of them are doing well and that they're finding joy and happiness in whatever they can. Thanks so much for watching with me, guys. If you have any suggestions of cases that you'd like me to cover, comment below. Let me know what you want to hear or what you thought of this case. Like, do you feel like it was fair that they got out when they did? Do you feel that Ed was the hero, or was it Mike? Just let me know. And I want to hear what other things you wanted to hear from me. I really appreciate you guys all joining me in bed tonight, and I appreciate that you stayed and watched. I hope to see you all in my next video, and we'll talk soon. Bye. Good night.